Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Shawn Talbot, the Director of Chapter Relations and Certification here at CAMFT, and I wanted to take a moment to thank you for joining us on the Chapter Policy Webcast today. Before we begin, I wanted to let you know that I have created a Policy on Chapters folder in the Chapter Leadership Group of the CAMFT community, and many of you are familiar with the CAMFT community. The folder now contains the new and old policy on chapters, as well as any other documents that were used to form the basis for the new chapter policy we will be discussing today. If you are interested in submitting questions, please use the GoToWebinar pop-up window that you should see on your screen. In that window, you will see a questions box where you can submit questions. And when you do submit your questions or feedback, comments, we would ask, in order for this webcast smoothly as possible, that if you could be as brief and as possible, it would be very much appreciated. With me today on the webcast is Jill Epstein, our Executive Director. Jill has put together a PowerPoint comparing the new chapter policy with the old chapter policy and a description of any other documents from which the new policy is based. The focus of the webinar today is specifically on the new chapter policy. I'd like to be mindful of your time. If you have questions about any topics not directly related to this webcast, please feel free to contact our Executive Director, myself, or other CAMFT staff outside of this webcast. And at this time, I would like to turn the webcast over to our Executive Director, Jill.
I'm sorry, here I am. Sorry about that, I was muted. Thank you all for taking time out of your day to be with us. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, although right now I feel like I'm speaking at you, but please do use that sidebar to communicate, send questions to Shawn. The outline of today's webinar is we'll talk about the purpose of the webinar. I will review the new policy on chapters, going through it item by item. I will then talk about the importance of a signed chapter agreement, talk about the next steps, and then open it up for Q&A. And I'll say right off the bat, it's likely I will not have all the answers, but I would like to just reference that this is the start of the conversation on this new chapter policy. So whatever we don't resolve or I can't address today, we will certainly be continuing this conversation going forward. So the purpose of today's webinar is to review the new policy on chapters, to solicit feedback, and like I said, start the conversation. The policy that we'll talk about today and your feedback will evolve into the language of the chapter agreements. And I want to reference that much of what you see in the new policy on chapters is exactly the same as in the previous policy on chapters, which was created in 1993 and updated in 2010. So as you can see, CAMFT sort of let that policy be the same for 17 years. It looked at it 2010. Now we're 3 years down the road. And so I wanted to compare them with the, just to be clear that it's not everybody has looked at this policy recently and is intimately familiar with it. So, so as we go through, I'll be highlighting the old versus the new. So on to the new policy on chapters. The first provision is regarding formation and rights of chapters. Chapters shall be formed in accordance with the provisions of the CAMFT bylaws. So long as chapters are in good standing, which includes but is not necessarily limited to full compliance with this agreement, its own bylaws, the CAMFT bylaws, the CAMFT Code of Ethics, and all other policies and procedures of CAMFT, chapters shall have the right to utilize the name of CAMFT and the name of the chapters, in the name of the chapters, to represent itself as affiliated with CAMFT and to receive all other benefits bestowed by CAMFT upon its affiliated chapters. And what you'll see following each slide is sort of the explanation. So the language about abiding by the CAMFT bylaws, code of ethics, and other policies reflects items 1 and 2 from the previous policy on chapters. The current bylaws, Article 8, Section 2, references formation of chapters. Wait, actually, I'm sorry, is that the old? Hold on one second. Yes, that references the bylaws. And this language also now reflects the right of the chapters to utilize the CAMFT name to represent itself as affiliated with CAMFT and to receive other benefits of CAMFT. The use of the logo was previously in a separate policy called the use of CAMFT logo, and the use of the CAMFT name was previously in a separate use of CAMFT name policy. So this document basically streamlines the terms and the rights. Under relationship, CAMFT and chapters are separate legal entities. Chapters are not and shall not be considered a partner, joint venturer, subsidy, legal representative, or agent of CAMFT. At no time shall chapters act or represent themselves to be acting in any of these capacities. Neither CAMFT nor chapter shall have the right or power to bind or obligate the other party in any manner, and shall not make or represent that it has the power to make any contract, agreement, representation, warranty, or obligation express or implied on behalf of the other party. Neither CAMFT nor chapters shall be liable for any act, error, omission, debt, or other liability of the or obligation of the other. There are benefits to the chapters and CAMFT to have their status, their separate legal status clearly stated. In the event that a chapter or CAMFT is sued, the group that is not being sued can argue that its assets are not subject to the suit because they're separate entities. And the old bylaws indeed indicated that chapters were this legal entity from CAMFT and from other chapters and shall be solely responsible for the conduct of its own activities and affairs. I would just like to comment that while we're separate legal entities, it's standard and even inherent in the relationship of a chapter using the parent organization's name that chapters must comply with parent organization rules and obligations. So it is a reasonable expectation when the brand is being used that there are certain rules, even if we're clearly legally separate. Under the bylaws, the chapters shall abide by and promote the purpose and objectives of CAMFT as set forth in the most current version of CAMFT bylaws. Chapters shall also adopt and abide by its own bylaws, which shall be in a form acceptable to CAMFT and which is consistent with CAMFT's bylaws. Chapters shall submit its bylaws and all proposed bylaw amendments to CAMFT for approval to ensure compliance with this paragraph. This is essentially the same as in the old policy item number 1. It codifies that chapters shall promote and the purposes and objectives of CAMFT as set forth in the bylaws, which is just, again, stating what was implied in the old policy. Chapters must now submit bylaws and proposed bylaw amendments to CAMFT for approval to ensure compliance. This is also pretty standard in most organizational chapter agreements. And really, it's useful for CAMFT staff to have access to the current bylaws to answer legal and governance questions from the chapters, which come in fairly regularly, both to Shawn and to our staff attorneys. I will also note that CAMFT attorneys are working on an updated model bylaws for your review and consideration, and that should be out hopefully later this summer, early in the fall. With regard to membership, clinical, pre-licensed, and associate CAMFT members in good standing, as defined by the CAMFT bylaws, shall be eligible for membership in chapters of CAMFT. Chapters may establish other categories of membership as they deem appropriate, and these individuals do not need to be members of CAMFT so long as individuals or entities accepted for such memberships do not otherwise qualify as clinical, pre-licensed, or associate members of CAMFT. Loss of membership in CAMFT as a clinical, pre-licensed, or associate member shall result in loss of membership in chapters. This is previous policy on chapters, item number 3, so there's no difference here. Obviously, what is different now is the way that members are defined in the CAMFT bylaws, but the provisions are still the same regarding what members you can and cannot accept. With regard to dues, chapters may establish and require chapter fees, dues, and assessments on its members. This was not previously spelled out in any other CAMFT policy, and it basically indicates that CAMFT will not interfere with any dues or fee structure developed by chapters. Board composition. The composition of the chapter's boards of directors shall be at the discretion of the individual chapters. As you probably are very familiar with, under the previous policy and under the previous bylaws, there was a limitation on chapter boards that they shall be comprised of no more than 35% associate or pre-licensed members, and such members shall never serve as president, president-elect, or past president. In cases of necessity, chapters could request a variance from CAMFT for a one-year period and could make separate requests for subsequent years. And I can tell you that that was not an uncommon experience, and was actually sort of inefficient when chapter boards had to come back to CAMFT for that authority each year. Now chapters can decide their own board composition based on their community. Annual report. Chapters are required to submit to CAMFT an annual report on the activities and financial status of the chapters within 30 days after the new chapter board is seated. Specifically, the annual chapter report shall include, but not be limited to, a list of outgoing and newly elected chapter officers and committee chairs. This has always been the policy from the old policies, and with this information is really important to us because we use it to populate the chapter leadership listserv, which is the primary way CAMFT communicates with chapters and the way you communicate with each other as chapter leaders. So this is something that many chapters have not complied with in the past, and it really makes things more challenging for both chapters and for CAMFT. So this is really important that we get this most up-to-date information as soon as the board turns over. On letter B, a summary of the past year's activities, including the number of regular and special meetings, topics, and any special events such as seminar and trade events. So again, we're talking about the annual report, what would be included. By collecting the data of your events, CAMFT can be a resource for other chapters with regards to programming ideas and speakers. And it also helps CAMFT understand the local member experience. Letter C, with regard to the annual report, we would be asking for a roster of current members, both voting and non-voting as applicable, the chapter's mailing list, including at a minimum the full name, mailing address, telephone number, and email address for each chapter member. This is currently in the old policy, item number 5, and we use this information to help us analyze our efforts to encourage members to join your chapters, and I believe it will be useful for the Chapter Advisory Committee as they work with CAMFT on recruitment efforts for the chapters.
Hi, everyone. It's Shawn, and I wanted to just mention that that roster of current members is also really important to us to be able to know which CAMFT members are members of the chapter. And as Jill mentioned, we track that information to make sure that our efforts at encouraging CAMFT members to become members of the chapters is working. So I wanted to add that as well.
Thanks, Shawn. Letter D under the annual report will include a balance sheet showing the current assets and liabilities of the chapter. This is a new provision and will help CAMFT assess the financial health of a chapter and provide guidance as needed. We have a lot of different expertise here at CAMFT, and we would be interested in and willing to help chapters who are facing challenges. So that is the intent behind that request. Under bank account and taxes, chapters shall establish and maintain their own bank accounts. Chapters shall obtain their own federal identification number for use in opening chapter accounts. Chapters shall obtain their own tax-exempt status or pay taxes as appropriate for the organizational structure. While this has never been formally required, this states the obvious. Any business entity needs to comply with these IRS and state requirements. CAMFT name and logo use. The distinction between chapters and CAMFT must be maintained. Communication by a chapter, officers, or member in correspondence, reports, or other materials must always identify the chapter by name. To use CAMFT's name and logo, CAMFT acronym by the chapter must always include the name of the chapter, not just the CAMFT name, so as not to confuse communications from CAMFT with those of chapters, especially when communicating with the general public. This captures the terms of the existing use of name and use of logo policies into this single document. Number 10, indemnification and defense. Chapters agree to indemnify, defend, and hold CAMFT harmless from any and all claims, loss, liabilities, damages, costs, including attorney fees and costs, that CAMFT or any other of CAMFT's past, present, or future officers, directors, employees incurs as a result of the acts of omissions of chapter or chapter's agreement. So this says that chapters have to be responsible, which I think would be undisputed by even the chapters. The old bylaws said that CAMFT shall not be responsible for any debts, liabilities, or other obligations of a chartered chapter. So again, this has been standard and would be frankly irresponsible of us if we didn't include such an indemnification section in such an agreement or policy. In most cases, I would say that the CAMFT insurance or the chapter insurance would cover third-party claims, but it's still, again, it's just a really important provision for to be included in a policy and in an agreement. Insurance. Chapter shall obtain and maintain at its own expense a broad form commercial general liability policy providing coverage of at least $1 million per occurrence and a $2 million aggregate. The chapter shall obtain a director's and officer's policy of at least $100,000 per occurrence for any act or omission committed by chapter or its officers, directors, employees, or volunteers during the time of this agreement which causes harm, liability, or damages to CAMFT or CAMFT officers, directors, employees, volunteers, or invitees. Chapter shall name CAMFT as an additional insured on the policies. Chapter shall provide CAMFT with written proof of insurance at any time requested by CAMFT, but no less than once a year. This is a new provision. So first, commercial liability protects chapters from damages claimed by a third party who's injured at a chapter event. A chapter having its own insurance helps illustrate that chapters are separate legal entities. We have talked to some insurers, and from what we understand, they will likely review your total number of members and your total number of events, and that based on our just anecdotal questions, it seems like we average about $500 per chapter for the commercial liability, the coverage that we are gathering most chapters do not have. That would be the new requirement. I can tell you that the board is considering ways to help chapters obtain this insurance and cover the cost insurance, and that's under conversations right now with the board. Continuing education. If a chapter serves as a continuing education provider, the chapter must be a provider in good standing with a relevant approval agency. This is new and was included to highlight for chapters that they must operate under their own CE provider number, not under any kind of CAMFT approval number. As a sidebar now, I just want to take this opportunity to give you a heads up about what is coming down the pike in 2014 and 15. In 2000, the BBS right now has proposed regulations to basically get out of the CE provider approval business. And to that end, they have designated approval agencies as entities that can approve CE providers on their behalf, and the BBS would accept CE from those from providers who go through approval agencies that they have designated. Currently, in the proposed regulations, the approval agencies are the APA, NASW, National Board of Certified Counselors, Association of Social Work Boards, and the National Association of School Psychologists. The board has just directed CAMFT to begin. The board has just directed CAMFT to begin building an infrastructure so that CAMFT can apply to the BBS to become an approval agency. And by doing this, it's a responsibility and an opportunity, the way I see it. It's obviously an opportunity as a separate business venture under CAMFT, but quite frankly, it's an opportunity, it's a responsibility to CAMFT since we have so many of our members and chapters who are currently BBS CE providers who will now have to find a new home for their CE provider status. And we believe that we would be able to serve as this entity and provide the oversight that is required under the new regulations for the CE approval process. So that's just a sort of a heads up that as of 2015, if these proposals go through as planned, then everybody who is a CE provider is going to have to find a new home for their CE provider number. And again, like I said, hopefully in the middle of 2014, CAMFT would be added to this list and would be an option for chapters and other members. Number 13, CAMFT member number. Chapter shall request CAMFT member number on chapter member application. This will help chapters ensure that they are accepting appropriate clinical, associate, or pre-licensed members. And the information assists CAMFT with properly identifying members with the correct chapter. So to avoid confusion with common names, it really helps us identify who is a member of which chapter. Suspension or termination. Chapter's charter shall be automatic upon the dissolution of CAMFT for any reason. The chapter's officer shall conclude the business of the chapters immediately upon notice of dissolution of CAMFT. A chapter may be suspended and its charter terminated by a 2/3 vote of the CAMFT Board of Directors. If the chapter has breached this agreement, or if the board believes that the chapter has engaged or is engaging in activities which are not in the best interest of CAMFT, sorry. Let me read that again. If the chapter may suspend and its charter terminated by a 2/3 vote of the CAMFT board if the chapter has breached this agreement. I'm sorry, that should say policy. Or if the board believes that the chapter has engaged or is engaging in activities which are not in the best interest of CAMFT. Revocation, if the board believes the chapter is engaging in activities which are not in the best interest of CAMFT, is language from the old bylaws. The new provision now allows the board to propose suspension as an alternative to revocation. And I think that's a really important provision because it allows the board to have a choice of remedies. There's an option before going to the full revocation that there's an option for suspension, which would give a chapter an opportunity to rehabilitate and correct whatever problem exists. The new provision also now requires a 2/3 vote of the CAMFT board to suspend or terminate, which is higher than a simple majority, which is what it was in the previous policies and bylaws. In the event that the board determines that suspension or termination of a chapter is necessary, the following procedure shall be followed. Chapter shall be given 30 days prior written notice of the proposed suspension or termination and the reasons for the proposed suspension or termination. Any notice of proposed suspension or termination shall be either personally hand-delivered or sent by overnight express mail service to the chapter's last address as shown on CAMFT records, as well as to the president of the chapters if that person's address is different than the chapter's address. The old policy, item 7, the chapter was given at least 60 days to respond in writing or refute or remedy the alleged noncompliance. This new policy proposes a minimum of 30 days. The new policy prescribes a notice delivery, which was absent in the old policy. The chapter shall be given an opportunity to be heard, either orally or in writing, at least 5 days before the effective date of the proposed suspension or termination. The hearing shall be held or the written statement considered by the CAMFT board to determine whether suspension or termination should take place. This is from the old policy, item 7, although that provided only the option to revoke. The new provision specifies that the chapter shall have an opportunity to be heard at least 5 days before the effective date of proposed suspension or termination. And these are the similar procedures and protocols for removing a member. The old policy, item 7, required the board to take action at the next regularly scheduled board meeting following the chapter's response and or hearing, and the new policy does not include those limitations of when the board can take action. So it's not limited to taking action on a quarterly basis. The CAMFT board shall decide by a 2/3 vote whether or not the chapters should be suspended, terminated, or sanctioned in some other way. The decision of the CAMFT board shall be final. As I mentioned earlier, the old policy and the bylaws did not require a 2/3 vote, only a majority. This adds protection to the chapters. Letter D, any court action challenging the suspension or termination of a chapter by the CAMFT board, including a claim alleging defective notice, must be commenced within 1 year after the effective date of the suspension or termination. This is new, and a 1-year statute of limitations is very standard in these types of agreements. Upon suspension or termination of a chapter's charter, the chapter shall cease utilizing CAMFT's name, acronym, and logo, all of which are owned completely and exclusively by CAMFT, and any other intellectual property owned by CAMFT, and may no longer claim any affiliation with CAMFT. This states the obvious ramification of a suspension or termination of a chapter. Number 15, audit. Chapters agree that they will make their records available for audit by CAMFT during the term of this agreement and for up to 3 years after any termination of agreement. This is a new provision, and audit authority is an important tool for ensuring compliance. It is not envisioned to be used unless there's a problem or a suspected problem with a chapter, in which case the CAMFT would need to do some further investigation. Ethics committees. Chapters may, but are not required to, create an ethics committee to advise the chapter's board membership regarding CAMFT's Code of Ethics and procedures. However, no chapter may establish its own Code of Ethics or make determinations regarding ethics-related cases. All such cases are subject to CAMFT's Code of Ethics and procedures for handling such matters. Any ethics committee created by chapters is advisory only. This is to clarify the distinction and role of a chapter's ethics committee versus the CAMFT ethics committee, which operates under the authority of the Code of Ethics. So that summarizes what the new policy on chapters. Those are all 16 provisions that are listed there. As I mentioned earlier, that policy and the ensuing conversation about this policy will become the foundation of a chapter agreement, which is expected to be created for 2014. And the difference between a policy and a chapter agreement is that a written and signed chapter agreement is enforceable in court and would make a difference in the event of a dispute. A written signed document makes it clear that the chapter is allowed to use the CAMFT name. The benefit to chapters and CAMFT to have a signed document, signed chapter agreement, and separate their legal status in an agreement is that in the event that either chapter or CAMFT is sued, the group that is not being sued can argue that its assets are not subject to the suit because they are separate entities. There is a benefit to chapters and CAMFT to have an attorney's fees clause, which would be included in an agreement, because if there is ever a dispute between CAMFT and chapter, the only way the prevailing party can recover attorney's fees is if that provision is in a written agreement. And finally, benefits to chapters to have the process for termination specifically set forth in a signed document. This prevents CAMFT from arbitrarily deciding to terminate a chapter. Chapters must be given due process, and the agreement specifies what the due process entails. So next steps in this journey. The first is that we would like to collect feedback on this new policy on chapters through November 15th. Chapter comments and suggestions should be sent to me. My email is up there, jepstein@camft.org, or you can send them to Shawn, of course, at any time through November 15th. The plan is for the board to consider suggested changes to this policy, additions, edits, deletions, at the December board meeting, and that would then, those changes and edits would be incorporated into a chapter agreement to launch in 2014. Once launched, chapters will have 60 days to sign the agreement. At this point now, I will turn it back over to Shawn for questions and answers.
Okay, thanks so much, Jill. And I wanted to synthesize a few of the questions that we've received. And if your question does not get addressed, please feel free to shoot your question over in that question box. But we had a question about why must chapters submit their proposed bylaws, and how does that, how does CAMFT utilize that information, and what would be the benefit of doing so? And immediately, what I could say is that we have chapters that call CAMFT and ask about their bylaws all the time. And sometimes the person who's talking to us here at CAMFT does not have the most recent version of the bylaws. I have questions all the time from chapters asking, well, can we do this with our elections? How much notice do we need to give to allow people to vote? What do we need to do about we have a board member, and we hope this situation doesn't happen, but occasionally it does. We have a board member who we need to possibly remove, etc. Chapters ask questions. It's beneficial for us to have the most recent bylaws on file, and I'm not sure if there's anything else that Jill would add to that as well.
Thanks. I think the other part is just that chapters' bylaws must be consistent with CAMFT's bylaws, and so the only way for us to ensure that they are consistent, in addition to providing you with the tools to make them consistent, is to see the final product and to see any proposed changes to that product. And again, that's where we can serve as a resource, as Shawn said, and as well as provide you with the tools needed to comply with this feature. But as I stated, this is a very standard provision in organizational chapter agreements.
Thank you, Jill. And I know we had a question about the CE provider, us becoming a CE provider entity, and how that, any impact that would have on chapters, and how that process would, if we were an agency, would we also be a continuing education provider as well?
Okay, thanks. So the way the BBS proposed regulation package looks is that they are getting out of the CE approval business, except for the fact that they are going to accept CEs directly from that are provided by CAMFT, AAMFT California, NASW California. The professional associations in California are still able to put on CEs directly and have those credits go right, be approved by, be accepted by the BBS. So CAMFT, nothing is going to change for CAMFT doing business as a CE provider. The real change is going to be for chapters and other providers, because you are no longer able to have to use your CE provider number by the BBS once these regulations go into effect. And that is expected probably around next July. The regulations will be final, and there's a delayed implementation of January 1st, 2015. So at that point, you as a provider will need to find a new home to get a new CE provider number. And what CAMFT is hoping to do between now and by the time the regulations are approved is to meet the new standards that are being set by the BBS for approval agencies, so that we can be an option for chapters and other members to consider as their provider approval agency. I can tell you now, though, that based on the regulations that are put forth by the BBS, it is going to be a very rigorous standard regardless of who you choose as an approval agency. There are going to be a lot more hoops to jump through as a CE provider. And, of course, all of this was designed to make sure that quality education is being afforded to licensees that will ultimately protect the public. So I can definitely shed some light that it is going to be a more rigorous approach regardless of where you go for your approval number. And then once you get an approval number, or CE provider approval number, whether it's from CAMFT as an agency or another entity as an agency, you will then be accountable to that agency for oversight. So that agency will then have the responsibility of overseeing your programs and making sure that you are meeting all the new standards that are required for CE.
Thank you very much, Jill. And I know that we received I'm going to, I think, read this question directly. Can chapters have purposes that are in addition to the purposes of CAMFT, so long as they are not in conflict with CAMFT's purposes? For example, to educate the public about clinicians, if that is not specifically in CAMFT's bylaws, or say to ameliorate the public mental health in our community.
That's actually a great question. I don't know the answer to that, so I'm not even going to give you what my gut tells me, but that's something I will absolutely look into, and we can sort of, Shawn, we can figure out a way to disseminate that answer to this group for sure, but I don't know the answer to that, but we will look into it. Thank you for raising that question.
Okay, and thank you very much again, Jill. And we have a question about the membership slide, and I think that's up for all of you to see right now. And the question is whether CAMFT is modifying who can join CAMFT, but wanting chapters to remain strict as far as their membership. Can you clarify that for us?
I'm not totally sure I understand the question, but what this means is that however CAMFT defines clinical, pre-licensed, and associate members is the way that that a chapter shall define the same categories. So I'm not sure if that directly answers the question. The chapters can still create other categories where people would not fall into one of those buckets, clinical, pre-licensed, and associate. So that is still okay as long as the person doesn't otherwise qualify for one of those categories. But the only change here is just that there are now new definitions for clinical and associate members.
I think that we've made it through the questions that everyone has. I wanted to give you all a minute or two to be able to submit some additional questions. I know Jill has indicated that this is going to be a process last through at least November 15th as far as we get feedback and comments from all of you, as well as, and of course, if you think of anything after this webcast, we would certainly encourage you to contact us. I did want to give you all a minute or two to ask some additional questions, and I think I've got one. And I think the question is about the terminology. Following CAMFT's policies and procedures is too vague, although abiding with bylaws is not. So is there terminology, I guess, that can be to abiding by CAMFT's policies and perhaps make it more specific?
That is certainly something we can look into. I think that's a fair question, and we can sort of look into how that could be specified or how it's clear to you what policies and procedures you would be required to adhere to. So that's something we can look into, and again, Shawn can communicate that answer back to you at the same time as the other one.
Okay, and let's see. I think that takes care of the questions that we have pertaining to the chapter policy. I wanted to mention also that we can make this PowerPoint available to participants, and that I wanted to reiterate that we do have a chapter policy folder, I guess it's Policy on Chapters officially, folder in the CAMFT community that lists any of the documents that Jill referenced. Also, we have a question about the 60-day versus 30-day notice. That was towards the end of the presentation. In the event the CAMFT board determines that suspension or termination of a chapter is necessary, and the terminology shifted from 60 to 30 days, and is there a particular reason that that was changed?
This is Jill. I don't think there was any great reason why it changed, so that's certainly something that can be considered, whether that should be reverted back to 60 days. I don't think there's any strong opinion one way or the other, so that's certainly something we can take under consideration.
Okay. With that having, and I have another question. Can the PowerPoint be saved in the CAMFT chapter folder? I would imagine that that refers to us placing that in the CAMFT community. And at any rate, yes, we will make that available, and likely that would be placed in the library of the CAMFT community, the chapter leadership group. We are also recording this session today, and I wanted to let you know that we will make that available to chapter leaders as you would like to, have that be available. And if I'm not seeing any other questions here, so with that in mind, I hope that this has been a good process to begin the discussion, and appreciate all of you participating. We do have one more question, and that is,
if a chapter does not sign the agreement, would it be placed on suspension?
Also a fair question. If a chapter does not sign the agreement within the specified time period, the CAMFT board would then start the process of suspension or termination as prescribed in the agreement.
okay. I am not seeing any additional questions come in. We appreciate your patience with this process, too, of having this as a webcast and trying something different with us, and hope that this has been a beneficial way to be able to see the changes rather than just talking about them. And if anyone, again, has any questions, feel free to contact us. You know how to reach myself, Jill, any of the other staff here at CAMFT. We appreciate your time and your input. It's very valuable to us, and we'll look forward to having a chance to continue this discussion in the weeks and months to come. So thank you, everyone, for your time, and hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day.